Next question is from, who do we have here? Amelia. What are the ways that harmony shows up in different cognitive stacks? Essentially, how does harmony look like when it's at driver, co-pilot, 10-year-old, 3-year-old? Great question. I'm going to give you a relatively short answer here because this is a very big question. So we could go into the different types and their different spaces, but I don't want to necessarily take the time right now to do that. So if you have a specific type, specific experience, and a specific example, then please forward that on to me. But in short, when the harmony, the outward facing feeling function, is in the adult self position, it's all about wanting to get along with other people, absolutely wanting to get along with other people, but having pretty good boundaries. Because remember, outward facing feeling, the more rehearsed it is, the more fluent you are in it, you understand that you are a part of everyone, as opposed to you just looking after everyone's feelings and not including yourself. So when you're in that space where the adult self is the harmony part of you, the one that wants to get along, then they often understand what they can and can't do. I have a very good friend, Beck, who is an ENFJ. And she has the most amazing boundaries. She's a country girl too. She's just such a dear friend of mine. And whilst we don't politically necessarily agree on a lot of stuff, there is this sense of wanting to get along and wanting to see from each other's perspective, and it's okay to disagree with things. It's okay. Like the care and the love isn't dependent on who's right or anything like that. So it's a really that's, for me, that's the harmony piece, like the person who's harmonious, that's at their best, when people are so strong in their own convictions, but they still want to get along with people and find solutions for things. So she's such an inspiration to me. I'm so happy, I'm so blessed to have her in my life, and I wouldn't change anything about her. So that's somebody that has the harmony as their adult self. Inner parent, now we're talking about an introverted person. So for example, INFJs, ISFJs, those kinds of people. It can be a bit of a blind spot because you're an introvert and it's your predominant extroverted space. So what I'd like to say about that is, you know, initially you have blind spots around setting the boundaries, so putting yourself into looking after everyone's needs, and you tend to just extend yourself and keep extending yourself all the time without good boundaries. And then what happens, of course, is you get exhausted. And then what can happen is the infamous INFJ door slam, which, you know, my interpretation of it is different to a lot of people's who are in different spaces of the maturity continuum, and that's totally fine. There are a lot of people, a lot of INFJs in particular, who want to use the door slam as their kind of predominant way of setting boundaries. But of course, that's, you know, you're already, if you get to that point where you're just kind of trampled over for so long, then you're already not setting boundaries in earlier stages of your relationship or whatever is going on. And of course, you're eventually, because you're so exhausted, going to have to set the boundary by closing the door. But while that, I think it's a good rite of passage that an INFJ in particular can understand that they have the power to say no. It's important to go through the experience of the door slam. It shouldn't really be your predominant way of setting boundaries, because if it is, it basically means that you're in that dependent space of the maturity continuum, which means that you're dependent on other people to treat you in a specific way in order for you to be happy. And if that's the case, then you won't set boundaries with other people because you're so dependent on getting that feedback from them. So if you're in that space, I really recommend that you do some for people within work, get yourself to a strong space where you have a strong sense of who you are, and you understand that you are allowed to set boundaries before it gets to that point where your exhaustion just it feels like you have no choice other than to close the door. And so that's oftentimes a space that people with harmony in the inner parent process kind of can find themselves in. Now, somebody that really inspires me with this piece is my friend Johanna, who is an ISFJ. And she has the same. She has the harmony in the inner parent and the introverted thinking, the inward thinking in the inner 10-year-old. So it's the same decision-making parts as an INFJ. And what I've seen her do over the years, but in particular when she's been doing the mentoring with one of our students as a case study client, is she's gone from just looking after everybody else and looking at what are the best things for everybody in different situations, and actually owned what she wants and what's important to her, and then ask for it, and not just backing off when somebody says, no, you can't have that, but to persevering to say, no, this is important to me. If you want to, for example, do business with me, this is how it has to be. If you want to have me in your life, this is how it has to be from my perspective. So you know, it's like you're able to just start talking about your values with people in your life, whether it's in your business life, whether it's in your personal life, whatever. But when your inner parent part of you, you know, that is the harmony process, gets really strong, that's what happens. You still absolutely want to make sure that everyone's needs are looked after. Absolutely, you want to do that. But you're also, you're putting yourself into the space of, hang on, these are the parameters within which I'm willing to do those things. So it starts moving almost into the ESFJ-like space of that being the adult self, because the more fluent you get at using something, the more it seems like you're a different kind of person. So for INFJs out there, if you're very extroverted, you're probably quite good at your inner parenting space, where, you know, you're extroverted in a way that is actually giving you happiness and results, not just giving. That's not healthy. So if you're in that space, you probably have started to move that part of you up in that maturity continuum and into a more adult self-like space. So that's very encouraging if that's what's going on for you. Now, the 10-year-old harmony piece is, so when we go into the inner child spaces, we're looking at predominantly black and white kind of space, and also very, you know, a yearning kind of space for the 3-year-old. So here's where harmony part of you can get a little bit more hidden, but doesn't mean that it's not as important. So as a 10-year-old piece, the harmony process can be very, very black and white, because the 10-year-old is a black and white space. It's because the harmony piece is about what's socially acceptable and what's not. If you get under a lot of pressure as a person with an the harmony part of you in the 10-year-old position, what happens is that you it's almost like a gut reaction to, you recognize what's right and what's wrong, but you're not necessarily able to do huge amount about it, because you're not necessarily in your power to do something about it. So you might get into these spaces where you just seem like you wait until you can't not say anything. So you tolerate something, you get along, and then when it gets to when it gets to a point where it's absolutely, you just can't help it, that's when you just lay it down. No, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, you know, you shouldn't be behaving that way. And that's oftentimes where it kind of goes with the 10-year-old position. But also when you are stressed, you just help, and you don't take yourself into much consideration until you get to that point of exhaustion as well. In the 3-year-old position, because we're now kind of moving down the scale into what's called like an inferior process, for those types, we're looking at really the harmony process being quite hidden, but having very specific need for belonging. So you might have a person who's particularly like doesn't ask for their needs to be met, but needs to belong, absolutely needs to belong, and has this yearning of being seen for who they are and how they add value to the situation. But they don't necessarily bring themselves into a situation from a place of empathy expressions of empathy, but they bring themselves into the position of here's how my thinking can be of value to in this situation. So you bring your thinking part, which is of course then in your grown-up parts. If your feeling is in your inner child parts, you bring that space of, hey, how can I help you figure this thing out? That's often something that a person with a 3-year-old three-year-old Harmony does. And actually, I just realized I didn't give a 10-year-old example for the Harmony. I don't have anyone that I know personally that has that in a predominant way, so I don't have a personal example on that. But the Harmony in the 3-year-old, one of my absolute favorite students, Chris. I mean, everyone's my favorite student, but Chris is very different because he's predominantly a thinker, and he has the feeler, the extroverted feeler in the 3-year-old position. So we're looking at somebody who doesn't get upset very easily, like doesn't get like, you can be really, really direct with these types of people, INTPs in particular. And something that I really just admire and love about Chris is that he brings his intent into the game, even though it's not emotionally charged. So his intent is still to belong. And it's just so inspiring and fascinating to see that with Chris. He's a perfect example of somebody who wants to get better at the extroverted feeling, and he deliberately looks for spaces to do that, and that is super inspiring. But also understanding that it's not going to be particularly graceful because it is in the 3-year-old position. So the intent of this person is to belong, is to get along, but they're not necessarily dependent on getting along initially. So once the kind of the thinking space is kind of satisfied, then after that the feeling space is the 3-year-old feeling, extroverted feeling space can be very, very hidden, but it's very much there for those people who are able to sense it. So we don't want to trample on the feeling space for people who, in particular, who have it in the inner child positions. Okay, so